Is long, but it bends toward justice. But in the state of California that I'm seeing this afternoon, sorry that I'm here on a kind of dash-in, dash-out basis and schedule, but I want to talk about it is just as necessary for the concerned person and the person of goodwill to condemn the intolerable conditions which continue to exist in our society, which cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative but to engage in violence in order to call attention to their problem. But after all, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and democracy have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, humanity, and equality.
On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr., America's most influential civil rights leader, was fatally shot on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. King had come to Memphis to help lead a march in support of striking sanitation workers. The assassination of MLK led to widespread outrage and civil unrest across the country and remains one of the most significant events in U.S. history to this day. Encyclopedia Britannica details the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister and civil rights leader whose nonviolent social activism brought the issue of equal rights to the forefront in America in the 1950s. His hard work and peaceful protests earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. After an unsuccessful strike in 1966 for better wages and working conditions, the Memphis sanitation workers went on strike again after 2 sanitation workers were killed as a result of a malfunction of their garbage truck. The leader of a group of clergy asked King to join them in supporting the strike, and so King helped lead a march. After violence erupted at the march, MLK returned to his home base in Atlanta. Despite death threats and illness, King felt compelled to help the sanitation workers, so he returned to Memphis and delivered one of his most inspiring and rhetorically brilliant speeches, known today as the Mountaintop Speech. Unbeknownst to King, a man named James Earl Ray had followed him to Memphis. Ray was a career criminal who had escaped from Missouri State Penitentiary a year prior. He was deeply racist, and many of his prison friends later recalled watching him fly into a rage anytime Martin Luther King Jr. was on TV. Ray was a huge supporter of segregationist George Wallace, so much so that he had volunteered for Wallace's presidential campaign while on the lam in California. On April 4th, James Earl Ray checked into Bessie Brewer's rooming house, which gave him an unobscured view of King's room on the second floor of the Lorraine Motel. At 6:01 p.m., Ray shot Martin Luther King Jr. while King was on the motel's balcony. The days following the assassination were filled with mourning and an overwhelming amount of rioting. Almost all major American cities experienced a rash of arson, looting, and violence. As the nation grieved, the manhunt for James Earl Ray began. Ray fled. The days following the assassination were filled with mourning and an overwhelming amount, which gave him an unobscured view of King's room on the second floor of the Lorraine Motel. At 6:01 p.m., Ray shot Martin Luther King Jr. while King was on the motel's balcony. The days following the assassination were filled with mourning and an overwhelming amount of rioting. Almost all major American cities experienced a rash of arson, looting, and violence. As the nation grieved, the manhunt for James Earl Ray began. Ray fled Memphis, ditching his car in Atlanta and making his way to Canada. From there he flew to London and evaded capture until he was apprehended while attempting to buy a ticket to Brussels at Heathrow Airport. He had been on the run for over 2 months. MLK's legacy lives on, inspiring many social justice groups and movements. His words and actions have influenced generations of people fighting for peace and equality. Every third Monday of January, we honor his memory with a national holiday.
It was the evening of April 3rd, 1968, and the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had just returned to Memphis. For over a year, as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he had been planning the Poor People's Campaign, an attempted expansion of the civil rights movement that would include economic and human rights for poor Americans of diverse backgrounds. In Memphis, that struggle was on display. King planned to march with 1,300 mostly black sanitation workers who had gone on strike in February seeking union recognition, dues checkoff, and an increase to their $1.65 to $2.10 an hour wage. Working conditions were hideous. The walkout had been precipitated by the deaths of 2 workers who had been crushed to death inside their own garbage truck. When King took the pulpit of the Bishop Charles Mason Temple on April 3rd, he sought to rally his supporters for a peaceful march, then scheduled for April 9th. He warned against the violence that had marred a previous protest, lest violence overshadow the justice of the Union's cause. Nearing the close of his address, he recurred to his vision of the Promised Land and of the peace that vision had brought him. This was not the first time King had prophesied his own death, but it would be the last. Less than 24 hours later, at around 6 p.m. on April 4th, King was shot dead on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel where he was staying. Memphis Night editor Doug Stone filed this urgent after confirmation from the police. Nobel laureate Martin Luther King Jr., father of nonviolence in the American Civil Rights Movement, was killed by an assassin's bullet Thursday night. King, 39, was hit in the neck by a bullet as he stood on the balcony of a hotel here. He died less than an hour later in St. Joseph Hospital. The Reverend Jesse Jackson said he and others in the King party were getting ready to go to dinner when the shooting occurred. King was on the second-floor balcony of the motel, Jackson said. He had just bent over. If he had been standing up, he wouldn't have been hit in the face. A shot then rang out. Jackson said the only sound King uttered after that was, "Oh." In Atlanta, Coretta Scott King learned of her husband's death as she waited for a flight to Memphis. Immediately, 2 police cars escorted her home, where she went into seclusion, receiving only family and close friends. Among them was AP reporter Katherine Johnson. A native of Columbus, Georgia, Johnson had been covering the King family since their return from Montgomery to Atlanta in 1960, when King took up the post of assistant pastor at his father's Ebenezer Baptist Church. The only female reporter in the Atlanta bureau, Johnson provided feature stories on Mrs. King for the State Wire. And while King himself was still a relative unknown in his hometown, Johnson began marching alongside him to report his activities, a beat she quickly carved out for herself. Her first-hand view of King, when she was often the only white person present to interview him, gave her special insight into the movement he led. In a 2007 oral history interview, she recalled the night King died.
When King was shot, I was with the date, and we were headed for a movie, and listening to the news because everything was so hot then you listened to the news wherever you were going. And we heard that King was shot. Well, we were just stunned, and he turned around the car and went to the King house. And it was pouring down rain on the night he was shot. And I went out in the rain, went onto the porch, and there were a couple of reporters, including a New York Times guy that I knew, and the police officer, and he said, no one is allowed inside, no reporters. And so the door opened and let somebody out, and Coretta was at the end of the hall, and she was recovering from major surgery then, and she was had on a long rose pink robe and a nightgown. And she said, she spotted me, and she said, let Catherine in. So the officer let me in. I was the only one that got in. And she said she was going to go she was going to lie down.
Johnson was the only reporter with Coretta Scott King from the assassination of her husband to his burial. On April 9th, at 10:30 in the morning, King's funeral began with a 3-hour service at Ebenezer Baptist Church. It was attended by close family, friends, colleagues of King, and members of the congregation. Following the Mass, Johnson hopped onto the roof of King's waiting hearse to get a better view of the dignitaries as they emerged. A silent procession of over 100,000 people formed to accompany King's casket as it was borne by 2 mules on a wooden farm wagon down Auburn Avenue to the gravesite at Morehouse College. It was then that it hit Johnson how transforming an experience it had been covering Martin Luther King.
When I grew up, as I said, we had a nurse whom we loved dearly, and we had a yard man, and we played with his 2 children. He would bring twin sons when they were growing up. But I did not know any other blacks except, his servants. And Dr. King really was so brilliant. My sense of justice and humanity was really aroused. It was aroused by covering the movement.
The assassination of Martin Luther King sparked the greatest wave of social unrest since the Civil War. Riots, demonstrations, window breaking, and the torching of buildings broke out in more than 100 U.S. cities, killing 35 and injuring more than 2,500. Democratic primary contender Senator Robert F. Kennedy had just landed in Indianapolis for a campaign rally in the heart of the African-American ghetto when he got word of King's death. Although his aides sought to shield him from potential violence, Kennedy insisted he keep his commitment and inform the crowd. Irwin J. Miller of the Indianapolis Bureau and Joseph E. Mobat, traveling with Kennedy, covered his 2-minute address. Many sobbed and cried openly in disbelief as Kennedy spoke. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another, Kennedy said. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend, and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that has spread across our land, with an effort to understand, compassion, and love.
For all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight. Martin Luther King times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together. I want to dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago: to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
So you heard the news on the radio? Is that the way you heard it? So you were driving. You left that gas station at 2nd and Linden. What, about 6 or?
I don't have any way of knowing. I think it's around that time, but I don't even know if it's Linden. I know the approximate area it is. And I've seen the map on the Enquirer.
And you were going back to pick up this man that you say is Raul?
No, I just waiting the car back.
So you heard all this confusion, turned and flipped on the radio. They said Dr. King's been shot. Did you think you were set up at that point?
No, I was headed toward New Orleans when I had the radio on. I used to keep the radio on. I think I didn't have too strong feelings about the shooting.
When you met Raul, you didn't know any other name for him. That's the name that he said was his, and that's all you ever knew.
Yeah, I did just know.
And you met him where?
Canada.
Up in Canada. Yeah. And you just met in a saloon, or?
It was a saloon in a waterfront area of Montreal.
You never became good friends then?
No, I wasn't good friend. Just business. These were all aliases, I assume.
You don't think Raul was a real name at all then, huh?
No, I've got some Freedom of Information papers and everything. There's Raul Santiago or something in New Orleans. It's supposed to be a him, but I don't have the FBI. That's material from the FBI files, but I don't have nothing to substantiate that.
So you think their mind was made up when they got you?
Well, it had to be made up. They couldn't. Well, I don't know if there's any penalty for extraditing someone fraudulently or not, but I think I can see their legal point where they've got to stick with their story.
"54 years after his assassination, Memphis clergy and community members plan to honor the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. tomorrow. On the anniversary of his death, the community is coming together to honor his life and legacy. Action News 5's Bria Bolton spoke with community members about commemoration ceremonies happening tomorrow. Bria, what are they saying?
Well, Ariana, 54 years ago today, Dr. King traveled here to Memphis in support of sanitation workers, and here he gave his last speech, "I have been to the mountaintop." Now, he was assassinated here at the Lorraine Motel just a day later. Now, visitors who were here at the Civil Rights Museum did tell me how they're remembering Dr. King. There are multiple events happening all over the city tomorrow, and visitors here, including civil rights icon Jesse Jackson, told me today how they're honoring Dr. King and how they plan to honor him tomorrow as well.
The 54th anniversary celebration of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the most important dates in Tennessee and across the nation to observe.
Bishop Henry M. Williamson, other clergy, and community leaders will commemorate the 54th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. with several events Monday. He says they plan to tour the historic Collins Chapel Connectional Hospital, the only hospital in Memphis to care for African Americans during segregation.
Dr. King called for nonviolence to bring about change against unjust and immoral laws and situations of segregation and discrimination. We need that in today's world.
They'll also be joined by civil rights icon, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who will hold a community rally at Mount Olive CME Church. He returned to Memphis Sunday to visit the National Civil Rights Museum, who will also hold their annual commemorative service Monday.
It was sad for me. I was in conversation with him and the shop was fired. So it's a real playback in my mind. It hurts still. I think about the progress we've made since that time happened.
Those visiting the museum say even though Monday marks 54 years since Dr. King's assassination, his sacrifice and legacy still lives on today.
I just wanted to be at this spot and see where it happened because it's so awful that, the world would have been completely different if he hadn't been killed. Just in awe of him.
Where we are today, from where we have come, we owe a lot to Dr. King. He went through a lot, and we owe him a debt of gratitude.
Now, the National Civil Rights Museum's commemoration ceremony starts tomorrow at 4:00 p.m. The rally at Mount Olive CME Church starts tomorrow at noon. And Reverend Jackson will also be discussing voting rights and President Biden's historic Supreme Court nominee for the Supreme Court, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference will also hold a walk from American Federal of State, County and Municipal Employee Local 1733 at their headquarters on Beale Street. That starts at 11 a.m.